Hey everybody, welcome to Wilder Action and Birds and Bees. I'm Paul Wright and I love macro in-flight photography. Right, it's time for us to get real and learn what's actually important. I can show you lenses and gear, but I don't see the point. We need to learn how to actually use the camera. Do you know what? To do that, we've got to go back to basics. I don't care what level you're at, you need to know aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Unless you do the hard graft and learn the easy things, you're not going to be able to learn the hard things. So I'm going to do a little bite-sized series to just show you the little bits and bobs that we do to be in control of our camera. By going back to basics, we're going to learn how easy it is to control the camera. And by teaching you, I'm probably going to learn some things along the way myself. In this series, I'm going to teach you how to shoot the camera properly to get the insects in flight that I shoot. I know there's a lot of other genres of photography, but I shoot insects in flight and a lot of people ask me how I do it. This is how I do it, but you have to learn each section to learn how to do it correctly, or in the way I do it, not correctly, because the way I do it is not correct. The way you do it is correct when you get the results you want. Today is all about aperture and only aperture. We won't be learning anything else but aperture. Aperture affects all photos, but I'm only going to be showing you from the perspective of an insect in flight photographer in natural light. Aperture is a very important element in the exposure triangle. All three elements, including ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, are important, and they're all equally as important as each other. I'll be explaining the exposure triangle in a separate video, as I think it needs its own section. Understanding how and why we use aperture will bring out the artist in you. It's not just a technical thing. I'm going to show you how and why it affects your photos. First of all, let's get the fundamentals of photography. The most important thing in photography is light. Without light, you have no photos. Without light, you have no photo. What is aperture? Aperture is like a window, but instead of the window being rectangle or square, the window is round. This window lets light in. Think of it like this. If you have a big open window, you can let a lot of light in. If you have a tiny window, you can only let a fraction of the light in. These fractions are called stops of light. These stops of light can be controlled by you or the camera. The stops of light are usually called f-stop, and that's all we're going to talk about today is f-stops. There are other ways it can be used, but we're only going to talk about f-stops to keep it simple. For any other technophobes like myself and that don't understand jargon, that the number that is given to aperture is actually backwards to us normal people. Weirdly, the smaller the number is the bigger the hole is, the bigger the aperture. The smaller the hole is, the larger that number is. And that's because it's done in fractions. There are lots of lenses in the world, and there's lenses that open up a much wider aperture than a macro lens. Macro lens usually start at roughly around about f2.8. Some other extreme lenses can go to f1, even wider, and go f0.7, but these are extreme lenses and they are not macro lenses. Macro lenses don't need to be that wide of an aperture because at such close distances, we don't have a lot of depth of field to deal with. I've taken some pictures here, and while I'm going through them, I'll explain to you why you don't need such wide apertures in macro photography. I'll show you how and why it's important to be in control of your aperture. If you understand this, you can understand how to make your pictures look aesthetically pleasing to others and yourself, obviously. Without this knowledge, your pictures can look flat or out of focus. Here, I have a series of pictures where I'm going to go through different f-stops. Instead of going through every f-stop fraction, I'm going to keep it in stops of light rather than third of a stops of light, just to keep it simple. And it's still not going to be simple if you don't understand. But hopefully, by looking at the pictures and looking at the f-stops, it should become clear to you why things happen. My macro lens only goes from f2.8 to f11, and I couldn't get far enough away to shoot at f2.8 as my camera reports the actual f-stop. Once we get into macro territory, aperture becomes more and more extreme. It's not the same as shooting a subject from far. Remember, while looking at these pictures, the larger the number is the smaller the aperture. I usually shoot for insects in flight between f6.3 and f11, but that depends on available light, distance to subject, and distance to background. But again, these other things will be explained in another video. Now we're dealing with aperture. Obviously, the most important thing we want is to get details on our subject. That is what I'm always looking for. The background is a bit harder to deal with. By playing with the aperture, we can determine what things look like in the foreground and in the background. We can make smoother backgrounds. We can make more detailed foregrounds and backgrounds. That all depends on what you're looking for. Look at the dial, how out of focus it is. And now look at the numbers, how out of focus they are. As we step through the aperture, you'll see the difference in the depth of field. It goes from thin to thick. If this was an insect, we'd want as much in detail as possible. And we want the background to be out of focus so that we can make the insect stand out. This is what I'm always looking for as much as possible, especially in dense backgrounds or cluttered backgrounds. Notice as we stop down the aperture, the numbers come more into focus as we go on, and so does the background. The details get finer and finer up to a certain point, and then we come into something called diffraction at roughly around about f11 to f16, which actually makes the details get softer again. My insect is not a flat subject. It goes from front to back, the same as these numbers and the dial. So I'd want as much detail, so as much depth of field as possible without intruding onto the background. I don't want to see the background. I want my subject to stand out. This is why I shoot between f6.3 and f11. You can imagine what happens when you get into macro distances. Your depth of field becomes thinner and thinner and thinner the closer you get. The length of your lens also impacts on this, and it also becomes thinner because of that. Notice we're starting to see details appear in the background. Imagine this was leaves or flowers. You can play with your depth of field to see how much of that you want in focus. Obviously, if this was a cluttered background, you'd want less of that to be seen. So you would maybe widen your aperture or get closer to make the subject stand out more from the background. Again, I haven't shown you the extremes of aperture, going from the very widest to the very smallest, because as I said, you can go from roughly around about f0.7 to f64, and probably higher with some really specialist lenses. But hopefully, even at these distances, which are not proper macro distances that I actually shoot at, I can show you how much of a difference the aperture makes. Remember, while all this is going on, the insect is moving. I'm having to move with the insect. So this is not a perfect science. This is a judgment call. The more you practice, the easier you'll be able to judge what's happening in your scene. So don't give up. It's all about practice, trial and error. Error is what I've done the most, and it's what's made me better at what I do, because I learn from my mistakes, and you need to learn from yours. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.